So the paper is a study in early modern political economy. What I try to do is understand a little better how people thought about the economy in England during the early decades of the 17th century. And the way that I go about doing this is by basically having a closer look at the records of English public administration at the time. So, usually we have this general idea that, well, in the 17th century, everybody was a mercantilist, and mercantilism is all about the balance of trade, and that's that. And so what I try to show is that there's actually much more behind that. And what I try to show in particular is that concern with the balance of trade, concern with a favorable balance of trade, was actually something that was very topical, very circumstantial. So it emerged when there was actually a problem with the balance of trade, but otherwise people were concerned with very different sorts of issues. And so that the way that I try to frame the argument is by using two very powerful concepts that were mobilized all the time at the time, which are the concept of freedom on one hand and the concept of order on the other. And so I try to understand the interplay between these two ideas, how these ideas that were widely shared values, so everybody wanted freedom and everybody wanted order, but the problem was concretely how can you reconcile these two things? To what extent can I eliminate a little bit of freedom in the name of greater order, or conversely, to what extent should I abandon the search for order in the name of freedom? And of course, different people have different interpretations of where that line should be drawn. So, for instance, we see a very important political movement in the early years of the 17th century called the Free Trade Campaign. So you have this very wide political agitation in favor of free trade. But of course, it's a very different notion of free trade than what we would sustain nowadays. So free trade was understood to be the liberty to act within your own capacity. So if you're trained for a craft, if you're trained for a profession, you should have the liberty to exercise that profession. So you shouldn't have a company that would restrict your rights to lawfully engage your profession. But it didn't mean that everybody should be allowed to do everything. So it's different from the way we conceive it nowadays. And there's also a very important discussion about the role of monopolies in society. So this is also a very important point of political dispute at the time. If you have a mercantile company, that company of course has some kind of monopoly rights, so they're restricting access to some extent. And then the question is, how far can this restriction be allowed to be carried on? And so some people are going to argue, no, there should be no restriction at all. People should, again, be allowed to exercise their lawful employment. But other people say, well, if this restriction brings some kind of social benefit, if we're restricting a little bit of freedom to gain something bigger in terms of welfare, in terms of the well-being of the Commonwealth, then well, this is a good policy, something that should be allowed to continue. And so I use these terms, these concepts, in an attempt to sort of understand and give a more concrete meaning to what we usually think of as these really big ideological umbrellas, free trade, protectionism, and I try to show how in practice these are usually much less simple than they seem. They involved several different kinds of political allegiances, and so they can mobilize in different contexts to support different types of arguments. And so when we think about them merely as theoretical arguments, as something that we can reason abstractly about and come to a conclusion about whether they're right or they're wrong, we're really missing the bigger points. And I think in that sense, the theme of the paper, the topic that I discuss in the paper is very, very contemporary. We're facing these same kind of issues still nowadays.